There is a particular type of ambition that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just arrives one day, quietly dressed in something ordinary, and by the time anyone realizes what it actually is, the game is already over. Sheev Palpatine is one of those stories, and it's a long one. Starting on a beautiful, somewhat pastoral world in the Mid-Rim, running through decades of Senate politics and Sith philosophy, and a war the galaxy didn't understand, it was already losing, and ending, or nearly ending, twice in very different circumstances, on opposite ends of known space. We're going to walk through all of it tonight. The childhood on Naboo, the teacher who changed everything, the political career that was two things at once for about 65 years, the war he ran from both sides simultaneously, and whatever you call what happens on Exegol. There's a lot of ground to cover, and none of it needs to be rushed. A quick note on sourcing before we start. A good chunk of the really textured early material, the childhood, the apprenticeship, the relationship with Darth Plagueis, comes from the Legends novel by James Luceno. That book is technically no longer canon as of 2014 when Disney reorganized the expanded universe, but a lot of it has been quietly absorbed or referenced in canon material since then. Where something is specifically Legends, I'll flag it. Where the two lines overlap or corroborate each other, we'll just enjoy the fact that they do. Right. Sheev Palpatine, born on Naboo, died on Exegol, and responsible for quite a lot of things in between. Let's start at the beginning. The planet Naboo sits in the mid-rim of the galaxy, which is a zone that tends to get overlooked. It's not the gleaming core worlds, with their ancient institutions and trillion-being populations. It's not the lawless outer rim, where half the interesting underworld stories happen. It's the middle, which in galactic terms often just means fine, relatively civilized, not particularly remarkable. Naboo, though, is a bit of an exception to that. It's genuinely beautiful by most accounts. Rolling green hills, pristine lakes, handsome cities built in an architectural style that looks like someone designed them primarily to be photographed. The Lake Country region in particular, which is where the old noble families tend to come from, has a particular quality of quietness about it. Lots of water, lots of landscape, the kind of place where money goes to sit still and look refined. The planet also has a somewhat strange internal geography. Below the surface, Naboo is essentially a giant honeycomb, hollow chambers and passages running all through the planet's core, filled with water, and in the deeper regions, a naturally occurring plasma. That plasma turns out to be worth a considerable amount on the galactic energy market, and it becomes one of Naboo's chief exports to the wider galaxy. That's going to become relevant later when we talk about the Trade Federation. But for now, it's just worth knowing that this apparently peaceful, aesthetically pleasing world has an interior that other people are very interested in. The population is split between two groups who have historically not had a wonderful time understanding each other. The Naboo, humans living in cities on the surface, and the Gungans, who are amphibious and primarily live in underwater city domes. The two cultures coexisted in a state of mutual indifference for most of their history, occasionally tipping into outright hostility. The peace that exists between them by the time of the films is relatively recent and was partly the result of a specific crisis we'll get to eventually. The human Naboo population had developed a somewhat unusual governance structure for the galaxy. Rather than inherited monarchy or appointed leadership, they elected their rulers. Their kings and queens were chosen by popular vote, and quite often those rulers were young, sometimes teenagers. The idea being, apparently, that youthful perspective balanced the conservatism of the Senate and the advisory councils. You can see how that might work in theory. You can also see how a sufficiently clever adult politician might find it quite easy to guide a young elected monarch towards certain decisions without her fully realizing it. More on that later as well. The noble families on Naboo sat slightly outside the elected monarchy structure. They were the old money, the people who had held land and influence for generations, who sent their children into the Senate, who shaped cultural and political taste without necessarily being in formal power. House Palpatine was one of those families, reasonably influential, based in the Lake Country, at a family home called Convergence, politically conservative in the specific way that old wealth tends to be. They liked things as they were, preferred Naboo to remain somewhat isolated from the broader galactic market, and had firm opinions about what their eldest son should become. Here's a detail about Naboo's political culture that I find quietly interesting. The language of diplomacy and philosophy was genuinely valued there in a way it wasn't everywhere. A young person from a noble house would have been educated in rhetoric, in history, in the careful management of perception. Whatever else you can say about Palpatine, and there is quite a lot you can say about him, he was an extraordinarily effective communicator. That's not an accident. Naboo trained him for exactly that. It's a bit strange if you think about it, that this particular world produced this particular person. Naboo is not obviously a dark place. It's not a planet of conflict or hardship or obvious grievance. It's a place where the political culture valued refinement and considered discourse, and the man who came out of it was, by any reasonable measure, the most destructive individual in galactic history. Not through military genius exactly, not through force power alone, but through an almost clinical ability to understand what other people wanted and then make them believe he was the only one who could provide it. That started on Naboo. Palpatine is from the capital city of Theed on Naboo, in a family called Palpatine. The exact birth year shifts slightly, depending on which source you're reading. 84 BBY in canon, 82 BBY in some Legends material. It doesn't change anything meaningful about the story, just places him at a slightly different age during key events. For what it's worth, canon has him born as the High Republic era was winding down, which is a period the newer books have been exploring quite extensively. He would have been a child in a world of confident, expansive Jedi outreach and relatively stable galactic democracy. The contrast with what he helped turn that world into is not nothing. His father was Kosinga Palpatine, the head of House Palpatine at the time. Kosinga is described across the source material as controlling, tradition-bound, politically conservative, and deeply uneasy around his eldest son from a very early age. That unease goes in interesting directions. The Legends material notes that Kosinga had Sheev tested at some point to confirm they were actually biologically related, which tells you quite a lot about the atmosphere in that household without needing to elaborate on it much. Not a warm home. The kind of family where the relationships between people are mostly formal and the warmth is directed toward institutions and legacies rather than actual people. There were younger siblings, at least 2 brothers and 2 sisters in the Legends account. Palpatine's described relationship with them was distant, verging on contemptuous. He saw himself as different from them, and apparently made no particular effort to hide it. The force sensitivity that would later define everything about him was present from birth, and the Legends novel suggests it manifested not as anything obviously dramatic, but as something subtler. A quality that made people around him slightly uneasy without being able to say quite why. The kind of unease you feel around someone before you understand what they're actually capable of. His father apparently claimed he'd known something was wrong with his son from the time Sheev was an infant. Whether that was Kosinga reading something real in the child, or just a father projecting his own anxieties backward onto a person he'd never trusted, is genuinely hard to say. It's the kind of claim that looks different depending on what you already believe about the person being described. What the source material is fairly consistent about is that Palpatine identified himself as different, exceptional, and destined for something larger from very young. That's not unusual in itself. A lot of ambitious people tell themselves something similar growing up. The difference is that in his case, it seems to have been completely untethered from any real connection to other people. He wasn't ambitious because he wanted to achieve something for someone, or because he loved something he wanted to protect. He appears to have been ambitious simply because he was capable of it, and capability felt like its own argument. The family was politically connected enough that Sheev would have moved in Senate circles from a reasonably young age, attending events on Coruscant with his father, learning the rhythms of political culture from the inside. He was, by all accounts, striking in those settings, charming without being warm, attentive without being intimate, good at making people feel individually considered while revealing almost nothing about himself. Kosinga wanted Narkbu to remain isolationist, to resist the expanding influence of the Trade Federation and the galactic market more broadly. Sheev had a different view, and his different view led him somewhere around age 17 to quietly feed political intelligence to a rival faction backing a candidate his father opposed for the Narkbu throne. Not for money, not because he believed strongly in the candidate's platform, mostly, as far as anyone can tell, to spite his father, and because it gave him something useful to be useful about. That's how Higo Damask found him. There's something a little sad about this section of the story, honestly, if you let yourself look at it that way. A teenager from a cold household, with a gift for making people trust him, and no one he actually trusted in return, actively working against his own family, because it was the most leverage available to him at that age. Not yet what he would become, just a very clever, very disconnected young man who hadn't yet met the person who would explain to him what all of that disconnection was actually for. That meeting was coming. But first, a bit of context about what he was walking into, because the Sith tradition he was about to join had been running for a very long time, under a very specific set of rules, and understanding those rules explains quite a lot about how Palpatine eventually came to do what he did. The Sith, at the point where entering this story, had been operating in complete secret for roughly 1,000 years. That's a long time for anything to stay hidden, let alone an organisation whose members are fundamentally prone to killing each other. The reason it worked is because of a man called Darth Bane, and his rather elegant solution to a very Sith-specific problem. The problem was this: the Sith, historically, were terrible at getting out of their own way. For centuries they'd operated as large, fractious armies, the Brotherhood of Darkness and its predecessors, and they kept losing to the Jedi despite, at various points, having more raw numbers. Bane watched this pattern and concluded correctly that the issue wasn't capability. The issue was that the dark side feeds on ambition, and if you put 100 ambitious people in a room and tell them they're all equally powerful, they will spend most of their energy fighting each other rather than anyone else. His solution was the rule of 2. 1 master, 1 apprentice. No more. The master holds the power and passes down everything they know. The apprentice craves more. When the apprentice becomes strong enough to defeat the master, they do, and then they take an apprentice of their own. Each generation, in theory, stronger than the last. The Sith went from an army fighting in the open to 2 people operating in complete shadow, never identified, never even suspected. The Battle of Ruusan in 1000 BBY is where Bane put this into practice. The Brotherhood of Darkness, led by a Sith Lord named Khan, was fighting the Jedi and losing badly. Khan, in desperation, used something called a thought bomb, which drew in the force energy of everyone present, Sith and Jedi alike, and destroyed them. Bane had stepped away before it went off. He was the only Sith survivor. The Jedi thought they'd won. They declared the Sith extinct. They were wrong by exactly 1 Sith, which was the whole point. Bane took an apprentice, a young woman named Darth Zana, and the line began. From Bane and Zana through several generations of master and apprentice pairs, each operating under an assumed public identity, each slowly working to undermine the Republic from within. It's a plan that required an enormous amount of patience. Bane knew he was setting something in motion that he would never live to see completed. He was designing a system and trusting future generations he'd never meet to carry it through. The grand plan, as it came to be known, had a simple endpoint: destroy the Jedi Order, seize the Republic, rule openly. The complexity was entirely in the execution. The lineage that runs from Bane down to Palpatine goes through several generations, not all fully recorded. Eventually it produced a Bith named Darth Tenebrous. Tenebrous is a fun one, purely for the contrast. The Bith are most famously known as the species playing in the Mos Eisley Cantina band. Tenebrous was one of the most powerful dark side practitioners of his era. There's something I find genuinely entertaining about that juxtaposition. The galaxy's terrifying Sith Master could theoretically have been playing upbeat jazz in a spaceport bar in another life. I don't know. The galaxy is a strange place. Tenebrous trained plagueis who we'll get to properly in the next section. But the thing worth sitting with here, in the context of what Palpatine would later accomplish, is the sheer institutional weight he was inheriting when Plagueis eventually found him. He wasn't just a young man being taught some dark side tricks. He was being inducted into the final stage of a plan that had been running for a millennium, with carefully accumulated political influence, financial networks, and a doctrine refined over 10 generations of practitioners who had each committed their entire lives to it. The Jedi, in all of that time, never found the Sith. Not often. The Jedi found the Sith more than once. They found artifacts, noticed dark side activity, worried occasionally about the return of some ancient threat. A handful of Jedi in the High Republic era came close to detecting the conspiracy, according to some of the newer material, but they never connected it to a coherent, continuing organization. The Rule of Two worked exactly as Bane had intended. It made the Sith essentially invisible by reducing them to a scale the Jedi couldn't scan for. For 1,000 years, two people sat at the center of the most consequential conspiracy in galactic history, and the one institution, specifically designed to detect that kind of darkness, never found them. It wasn't until Qui-Gon Jinn encountered Darth Maul on Tatooine in 32 BBY and reported back to the Jedi Council that he'd been attacked by something that moved like a Sith, that the Order even began to suspect the truth. The Council's response was to acknowledge that if it was a Sith, there must be another one somewhere, because of the Rule of Two. They eventually figured out it was their own Chancellor. Now, the person who trained that Chancellor was Darth Plagueis, and he deserves his own section, because he is genuinely one of the more interesting figures in this whole story. Since we're on the topic of the Rule of Two's long chain, it's worth spending a moment on what that lineage actually looked like in practice across the centuries, because it wasn't a clean progression of calm philosophical inheritance. The Rule of Two was designed to produce stronger Sith with each generation, and the way it did that was by ensuring the apprentice would eventually try to kill the master. That was the mechanism. You train someone to be more powerful than you accept that this means they will eventually come for you, and the one who succeeds passes their knowledge on to their own eventual successor. It's a tradition that runs entirely on ambition and betrayal, which is either elegant or appalling depending on how you feel about those things generally. Darth Zannah, Bane's first apprentice, took decades to challenge her master. Bane grew impatient toward the end of his life and sought to transfer his spirit into her body, rather than wait for her to become strong enough to defeat him, a technique that would recur in this lineage in interesting ways. Zannah won in the end and became the Sith Master. After Zannah came Darth Cognus, a woman who later found through a series of circumstances another would-be Sith named Millennial, who rejected the Rule of Two entirely and took his own followers off to form a separate dark side cult. Bane's framework treated this as the system self-correcting, weeding out those who lacked the discipline to follow it. The generations after Cognus are less documented in both legends and canon, but the shape remains the same. Master passes knowledge, apprentice grows stronger, one of them eventually dies and the tradition continues. Darth Tenebrous, as mentioned, was a Bith, which remains one of the more quietly charming details in all of Sith history, who had his own particular variant of the Sith tradition's interest in the future. He had apparently calculated, using predictive force abilities, that his apprentice would produce a being of extraordinary force potential, which was the specific reason he'd arranged Plagueye's birth in the first place. Tenebrous was trying to engineer a Sith who would eventually solve the larger problem of the grand plan. He was not wrong that Plagueis would be significant. He was wrong about being able to control what that significance would look like. The broader point is that by the time Palpatine entered this tradition, the accumulated knowledge he was inheriting represented 1,000 years of the galaxy's most dedicated dark side practitioners, each building on the last. The light side tradition of the Jedi was ancient and deep. The dark side tradition that Bane had restructured was older still in its roots, and the discipline of the Rule of Two had concentrated it in ways that the older Sith model, the armies and the open warfare, never had. Palpatine wasn't inheriting a philosophy, he was inheriting a weapon. Higo Damask was, on paper, a moon banker from Megiddo with an extremely successful financial corporation and a talent for attending the right parties. In practice, he was Darth Plagueis, Sith Master, the latest link in Bane's chain, and probably the most intellectually unusual figure in this whole story. What makes Plagueis interesting, separate from his role as Palpatine's mentor, is that his obsession wasn't really power in the conventional sense. He had power, certainly, and he understood its value. But what he actually spent most of his intellectual energy on was something more specific. He was trying to solve death. Not metaphorically, literally. Plagueis had developed a theory based on deep study of the Force and specifically of midi-chlorians, the microscopic symbiotic organisms present in all living things that allow Force users to channel the Force, that death was not actually inevitable, that with sufficient understanding of how midi-chlorians functioned, it might be possible to manipulate them in ways that prevented the biological processes of dying from completing. He had already, in experiments on various subjects, managed to extend life beyond its natural span. He believed with genuine conviction that immortality was achievable if he could just push the research far enough. His public life as Higo Damask was a means to that end. The financial network gave him resources. The political influence gave him freedom of movement. The Sojourn gatherings, these annual meetings he hosted on a private moon, pulling in senators, trade guild leaders, crime bosses, influential figures from across the galaxy, gave him levers to pull across every institution in the Republic simultaneously. It sounds abstract until you realize this was the operational infrastructure the grand plan had been missing for centuries. Bane had designed the philosophy. Plagueis built the machinery. The gatherings are worth a moment because they're a good illustration of how the Sith operated during the Rule of Two period. On the surface, they were exclusive retreats where powerful people networked and made deals. In practice, they were a Sith tool for cultivating influence while appearing to simply host very good parties. Plagueis wasn't attending these things because he enjoyed small talk with senators. He was mapping the Republic's pressure points. He was also, in the background, conducting what you'd have to charitably call experiments. There was a Bith named Darth Venomous, his master Tenebrous's secret backup apprentice, who Plagueis had defeated and then kept in a medically induced coma on Munilinst, using him as a living test subject for his midi-chlorian research. That detail is either the most unsettling thing in the whole story or simply the most Sith thing, which I've started to suspect are the same category. The midi-chlorian work led Plagueis to a theory that the story raises and then, wisely, declines to fully answer. Working with Sidious in the years leading up to the Clone Wars, the two of them conducted rituals intended to coax the Force itself into producing a life from nothing, to essentially will a living being into existence. Shortly after their experiments, a slave woman on Tatooine named Shmi Skywalker gave birth to a child with no father. That child had the highest midi-chlorian count ever recorded. Whether Plagueis and Sidious accidentally created Anakin Skywalker as a side effect of their experiments is something the Legends text raises as a possibility without ever confirming. Qui-Gon Jinn thought he was looking at the chosen one of a Jedi prophecy. Plagueis might have thought he was looking at an unintended consequence of his own research. It's a genuinely interesting ambiguity, and one I'm glad the writers left open rather than resolving. Publicly, Damask Holdings had legitimate business interests across the Mid-Rim and Outer Rim. On Naboo specifically, Plagueis had been working to support a candidate for the monarchy, a man named Bon Tapalo, in exchange for exclusive rights to the planet's plasma reserves. It was during this Naboo-related business that he first encountered a 17-year-old nobleman who had been quietly helping Tapalo's campaign against his own family's wishes. Plagueis' initial interest in the young Palpatine wasn't specifically about the Force, it was about the shape of his ambition. Here was a teenager from a respectable family who was calmly, methodically working against his own father's political interests, with no obvious personal gain, apparently just because he'd decided to. The Force sensitivity Plagueis detected when they actually met was almost secondary to the picture that was already forming. He began using Palpatine as an informant on Naboo's political landscape. Palpatine, in turn, saw in Damask something he'd been missing, a genuinely powerful person who treated him as interesting rather than problematic. There's a line in the novel about Palpatine recognizing that he was being manipulated, and not particularly minding, because the manipulation was coming from someone worth being manipulated by. That's a very particular kind of psychology, and it tells you quite a lot about both of them. The Sojourn gatherings, the more I think about them, are one of the better illustrations of how Sith political power actually functioned during the Rule of Two period. Plagueis didn't just accumulate money and influence passively, he actively maintained a network of the galaxy's most powerful people, keeping them in a state of mild mutual obligation through the social machinery of an exclusive retreat. A gathering would typically include senators from influential systems, the leadership of the major trade guilds, representatives of the banking institutions, and occasionally figures from the criminal organizations that operated in the grey spaces between law and commerce. On the surface, it was a networking event. In practice, it was a map of leverage. Plagueis knew who owed whom favours. He knew which senator's vote could be moved by which kind of pressure. He knew which trade guild leader would respond to financial incentive versus reputational concern versus direct threat. That knowledge, accumulated across decades of these events, was the substrate on which the entire Grand Plan's political phase was built. Palpatine inherited this network. When he became a senator and then a chancellor, he wasn't starting from nothing politically. He was stepping into a web of relationships and obligations that Plagueis had been building and maintaining for a century. The ease with which he seemed to accumulate political influence, which made him appear extraordinarily naturally gifted as a politician, was partly genuine talent and partly the fact that he'd been handed a running start that no one around him could see or account for. The difference between Plagueis' approach and Palpatine's is worth noting. Plagueis worked through financial and corporate power primarily. He was a banker at heart, and his leverage was mostly economic. Palpatine worked through the direct machinery of political institutions, the Senate, the Chancellorship, the formal structures of governance. Together, across the period of their collaboration, they covered essentially every lever of power available in the Republic. When the moment came to push, there was almost nothing left that could push back. The confrontation with Kozinga Palpatine happened in 65 BBY, shortly after Plagueis had accelerated his cultivation of the young nobleman. The exact sequence of events runs roughly like this. Kozinga discovered his son had been feeding political intelligence to a rival faction. He confronted Higo Damask about it, presumably not knowing who Damask actually was, just that this foreign businessman had been spending time with his son and apparently influencing him against his family's interests. He threatened to send Sheev away, to cut off the relationship entirely. Damask's response in the Legends account was to meet privately with Palpatine and tell him a story. The story was about how Damask himself had, when young, killed his own family to free himself from their constraints and inherit what was rightfully his. He presented it as a kind of precedent, a permission slip almost. He later admitted that only some of it was true, and it's fairly clear the version he told Palpatine was heavily embellished specifically to see what the young man would do with it. Palpatine suspected in the moment that he was being goaded. He did it anyway. What happened on the Palpatine family starship is described in the novel as a force rage, a moment of uncontrolled dark side energy released in a confrontation with his father that expanded to encompass his mother and his siblings before it was over. According to legends, Palpatine killed all of his immediate family members, every member of House Palpatine except himself. Plagueis' agents arrived shortly after. The evidence was managed. Officially, the family died in an accident, and then Darth Plagueis introduced his new apprentice to the rule of two. I want to pause on this for a moment, because I think it's worth acknowledging that this is the point where Palpatine becomes something different from what he was before. Before this, he was a clever, ambitious young man with a difficult family and a talent for politics. After this, he's something more intentional. He made a choice. It wasn't made under duress. He could have walked away from Damask, could have let his father end the relationship, could have gone back to the conventional path of a Naboo nobleman. He didn't. He committed, and in committing, made sure there was nothing left to go back to. Whether he felt anything about his family is genuinely unclear. The source material doesn't give him a grief scene or a moment of doubt afterward. What it gives him is the sense of a person who had already emotionally left that family some time before the ship. Whether that's scarier or more comprehensible probably depends on your own relationship with the concept of detachment. The apprenticeship that followed was thorough. Plagueis wasn't training a soldier, he was training a politician and a strategist, shaping someone who would need to move through the highest levels of Republic society for decades without ever attracting the right kind of scrutiny. The Force training was real and rigorous, but the political education was at least as important. Sidious learned the history of the Sith, going back through Bane's lineage. He learned the grand plan. He learned how the Republic worked from the inside, its pressure points and its tolerances, which institutions mattered and which ones were already hollowed out. He also, on his own initiative, went looking for a weapon. The political career could proceed slowly, methodically, but Sidious seems to have decided early on that having something capable of actual physical violence at speed, something that could handle problems that politics couldn't, was a valuable thing to have. That search eventually led him to a red-skied world called Dathomir. More on that shortly. For now, the double life was settling into its long-term shape. Palpatine, rising Naboo politician, charm and moderation in everything. Darth Sidious, Sith apprentice, learning everything his master knew, and already beginning to think carefully about what came after. The formal title, Darth Sidious, is interesting in itself, though the source material never provides a clean etymology for it. Sidious contains insidious, which might be intentional on George Lucas's part, might be coincidence, might just be trusting that names do work on a subconscious level, even without explanation. What the name marks is a point of identity shift. From here, in the Sith tradition, Sheev Palpatine has a second self, with a lineage going all the way back to Darth Bane. The training years are not heavily dramatized in most of the source material, which makes sense. Plagueis was methodical rather than theatrical, and his approach to instruction was more about depth than spectacle. What comes through across the Legends novel and various canon material is that Sidious was an exceptional student in the specific way that mattered most. He was able to integrate everything he learned into something coherent and usable, rather than storing it as disconnected information. His lightsaber technique, for instance. Plagueis wasn't a combat-focused master. His personal strengths were in force manipulation, in life and death energy work, in the intellectual side of the dark side. Sidious developed his fighting style largely on his own, and what emerged was something quite unusual. He favoured speed over power, using a technique that Jedi combatants would later find almost impossibly difficult to track. He practiced in ways that apparently alarmed even Plagueis at times. Whatever else he was, the man was committed to being genuinely dangerous. His Force development ran in parallel. Force lightning, which would become his signature ability, is a dark side technique that requires a specific willingness to channel destructive energy directly through your body. It's not subtle and it's not patient. It's a fairly direct expression of contempt for whatever you're pointing it at. Sidious developed it to an extraordinary degree. The control of it, the ability to modulate intensity, to sustain it for extended periods, to use it as a communication as much as a weapon. That control set him apart from most other practitioners in the galaxy's history. The public career was running at the same time, building steadily. Palpatine's trajectory through Nahbu politics and into the Galactic Senate followed a path Plagueis had partly laid out, making useful alliances, building reputation, cultivating the persona of the thoughtful moderate who could be trusted by everyone, because he appeared to threaten no one. One thing worth noting about this period is that Palpatine was, in some ways, genuinely good at his public job. The speeches referenced in the source material were actually impressive as rhetoric. He understood policy, he understood what people needed to hear, and how to make them believe he was the one who understood that better than anyone else. That's not a trivial thing. A lot of people with purely cynical goals at his level are eventually found out simply because they're not actually competent at the thing they're pretending to be. Palpatine was competent. That's part of what makes the whole story work. The double life was expensive in one specific way though. It required near-perfect compartmentalization at all times. The Jedi were present on Coruscant, their temple was there, their members moved through the same political spaces Palpatine was navigating. He couldn't afford a single lapse. Not once across roughly 50 years of this did he give them a clear enough signal to act on. That's either extraordinary discipline or extraordinary naturalism, probably both. Now, talking a bit about the public career in more detail and what those decades in the Senate actually looked like, there's a practical texture to the double life that I find worth exploring a bit more, because it's easy to think of it in abstracted terms: two identities, two sets of behaviours, kept neatly separate. And the reality of what that would actually require over 5 decades is considerably more interesting and considerably more demanding. Consider the specific problem of the Jedi Temple. It was on Coruscant. Palpatine was on Coruscant. Jedi Masters moved through the same political spaces he was navigating. The Order had, among its various capabilities, a sensitivity to the dark side of the Force. Not infallible, not a scanner that could identify Sith on demand, but a general perceptual capacity that had served them reasonably well across the galaxy's history. Palpatine had to maintain his surface affect around Force-sensitive beings for decades without ever projecting anything that would register as alarming. That meant, in a very practical sense, that the performance couldn't ever slip. Not at a dinner, not in a meeting, not when Yoda was in the room, which happened regularly given that Yoda was on the Council, and the Council had dealings with the Chancellorship. The Legends novel addresses this in a few places, noting that Sidious had developed specific techniques for masking his dark side presence, drawing it inward, presenting a kind of neutral Force signature that read as ordinary rather than absent. This is different from just behaving calmly. It's a Sith alchemy-based alteration that persists without conscious effort in social situations. The effort involved in that, sustained across decades, is not nothing. And then there's the bureaucratic reality of the Senate. The Chancellor's office received enormous amounts of correspondence, had to manage legislative sessions, had to coordinate with planetary governors, had to maintain the appearance of democratic governance, even as Palpatine was quietly dismantling the conditions that made governance democratic. The Legends material suggests he genuinely read everything that came across his desk, had a near-perfect memory for legislative history and political relationships, and was, in the administrative sense, actually doing his job properly while also running a galaxy-spanning conspiracy. Whether that's admirable in some completely separate sense from everything else about him is a question I'll leave where it sits. The duality was never a burden in the way it might be for someone who had been something else first and then become Sith. Palpatine had been both things simultaneously since he was 17. The Palpatine that the Senate knew was not a false front laid over the real person. Both were real in the sense that both were continuous expressions of the same underlying identity. The warmth was a technique, but it was a technique he'd been practicing for 60 years, which makes it something more than merely performed. Palpatine formally entered the Galactic Senate as Naboo's representative, and by most accounts his early years there were unremarkable in the best possible sense. He was considered thoughtful, measured, and reliably moderate. He made enemies. He didn't make loud alliances. He did, very quietly, make himself useful to an enormous number of people in ways they would find difficult to repay, except by supporting him in future votes. The Senate of the late Republic was not, by this point, a particularly healthy institution. The problem wasn't ideology. There were genuine debates happening in those chambers about real issues. The problem was structure. The Senate was enormous. Thousands of member worlds, each with their own delegations and interests and factions. Any large coalition could be blocked by a sufficiently motivated minority. And the lobbying infrastructure around the Senate, the Trade Federation, and the banking clan, and the various corporate interests who had essentially purchased Senate seats through client worlds, meant that significant legislation moved at the pace of whoever needed it to move, and had the money to make it happen. Palpatine moved through all of this with remarkable ease, partly because he genuinely understood how it worked, and partly because he appeared to want nothing for himself. That second quality made him seem safe. He was the person senators went to when they needed an honest broker, someone who wouldn't use the favour against them later. He was not, obviously, an honest broker, but he was careful enough that no one realised it. Supreme Chancellor Finis Valorum was, in this period, Palpatine's closest equivalent to a patron at the upper levels of power. Valorum was a genuine Republican, someone who believed in democratic institutions, a decent man in many ways, and someone who trusted Palpatine completely. They had a working relationship that looked, from the outside, like actual friendship. Valorum regularly sought Palpatine's advice. He publicly supported his career. He treated him as an ally. This is the kind of detail that becomes almost difficult to sit with in retrospect, knowing what Palpatine would eventually do to him. Valorum's political downfall, the vote of no confidence that removed him from office, was orchestrated by Palpatine and executed through a young queen he'd helped guide into the Senate chamber for exactly that purpose. Valorum never understood what had happened. The source material suggests he spent years afterward trying to make sense of it. Masa Meda is worth a mention here too. The Chagrian vice chair of the Senate eventually became one of the very few people in the galaxy who knew Palpatine's actual identity. He became aware at some point during Palpatine's chancellorship that the man he was working for was Darth Sidious. His response was not to object or to alert anyone. He became a close collaborator. What that says about Ameda is its own interesting question, and one the source material doesn't fully resolve. The pattern of Palpatine's Senate years is, in retrospect, fairly clear. Every crisis that inconvenienced his rivals also advanced his position. A vote that seemed to be about something purely procedural would quietly shift the balance of something else 2 bills down the line. A speech given at what appeared to be a difficult moment would, on rereading, turn out to have positioned him as the only reasonable option. The Legends novel has a specific scene where he gives a speech about a trade federation vote that his biographers later called career-making. The Chancellor at the time personally reached out to commend him. The speech was actually designed to produce a specific outcome for a specific faction in exchange for a specific future favour, but it sounded magnificent. There's a quality to this period that I find oddly fascinating. The Senate years aren't dramatic. There's no visible villainy. What's happening is accumulation, small advantages, managed relationships, carefully maintained reputation. It's the least cinematic part of the whole story, and possibly the most important part, because without those decades of groundwork, nothing that came after would have worked the way it did. And alongside all of this, the Sith work was running underneath the whole time. The Force training, the cultivation of something Sidious had decided he needed, all of it proceeding quietly while the senator from Naboo kept showing up to committee meetings and being trustworthy at dinner. Dathomir is one of those Star Wars planets that, the more you learn about it, the more you understand why it produces the specific things it does. It's a red-skied world, heavily forested, difficult terrain throughout, and home to the Night Sisters, a clan of Force-sensitive human women who used what they called Spirit Ichor, a physical manifestation of dark side Force energy in their rituals and combat. Their relationship with the dark side was old and entirely their own, developed independently of the Sith tradition, and in many ways quite different from it. Mother Talzin was the Night Sister clan leader during this period, and she had her own complicated political relationship with Darth Sidious. The details vary between legends and canon, but the broad shape is that Sidious made promises he didn't fully intend to keep, and Talzin eventually found that out in the worst possible way. One of Talzin's sons was a Dathomirian Zabrak, a species usually associated with Iridonia, though Dathomirian Zabraks are a distinct subspecies with different markings. He was taken by Sidious as a child, somewhere around 40 Boboid, which puts him at roughly 14 when the formal apprenticeship began. What training under Darth Sidious actually looked like has become somewhat clearer in recent years, particularly through the animated series and newer material. It was brutal by most standards. Force lightning was used as a training tool, not metaphorically, as in, this is challenging, but literally. When Maul failed to perform well enough, Palpatine shocked him. The purpose was partly to toughen him, partly to keep him in a state of constant controlled anger, and partly, it seems, to ensure that the rage he directed outward had the right intensity. Happy people are not especially effective as weapons, which is roughly how Sidious seems to have regarded him. Maul believed, genuinely, that he had a special destiny in the grand plan. Sidious told him he was essential, that his role was central, that he was being prepared for something that would change the galaxy. That was true in a limited sense. Maul was genuinely intended to be the Sith's public face when the time came, the blade that would cut through the Jedi at the moment of revelation. But Sidious seems to have regarded him more as a weapon than as an heir, and the question of whether Maul would have survived to see the plan completed is one that, given what eventually happened, you're inclined to answer in the negative. What Maul became under Sidious's training was remarkable by any standard. The combat ability alone was extraordinary. Dual-bladed lightsaber technique, acrobatic and aggressive, terrifyingly fast, with a physical presence that used his Zabrak horns and his sheer intensity as psychological weapons before the actual fight even began. He was also, it turns out, more perceptive than Sidious perhaps intended. Maul understood more about the plan and about his master than Sidious might have liked, and his survival of what should have been his death on Naboo was partly driven by a rage directed specifically at Kenobi, but also by an awareness that the story wasn't finished. There's a vision he has, years after the Phantom Menace, showing young Maul training with Sidious, his brother Savage, begging him not to go, Maul submitting, and then years of the lightning. Of being shaped into something specific and disposable by someone who was, at the same time, being publicly warm and trustworthy to everyone in the Senate. The contrast is pretty stark when you hold both images together. The Plagueis question in this period. In the Legends account, Plagueis knew about Maul and considered him a tool rather than a true Sith in the Rule of Two sense. Maul was operating in a slightly grey area. Technically, Sidious wasn't supposed to have an apprentice while still apprenticed to Plagueis, but the fiction was maintained that Maul was more of an asset than a Darth in the formal sense. Whether that distinction was philosophically meaningful is something the Sith tradition might have debated at length, if anyone had been left to debate it. The timing of Plagueis' death in the Legends account is one of those narrative details that becomes more meaningful the longer you sit with it. The night Palpatine was elected Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic was also, apparently, the night Plagueis died. After the Senate vote, Sidious went to see his master. They celebrated together. Plagueis drank, relaxed, fell asleep, and Darth Sidious killed him. The particular bitter irony doesn't require much embellishment. This was a man who had dedicated decades to the scientific problem of defeating death, who had kept a living test subject in a coma for years to experiment on, who had, by his own assessment, made genuine progress toward immortality. He was murdered in his sleep, in comfort, by the person he'd chosen, trained, and arguably loved in the specific way that Sith Masters seem capable of loving, which is to say, instrumentally and then not at all. The line that Palpatine delivers to Anakin Skywalker years later at the opera, "He could save others from death, but not himself," is the only moment in the films where he comes close to acknowledging this relationship. Palpatine presents the story as if it is about a historical Sith he knew, told as a philosophical aside to Anakin. He doesn't identify himself as Plagueis' apprentice. He doesn't identify himself as the person who killed him. He just tells the story with a certain quality of intimacy that, on rewatching, you notice. In the current canon, the exact timing is left somewhat looser. The sequence isn't definitively established in the same way as in the Legends novel. But the broad shape is consistent. At some point before or around the Phantom Menace, Sidious murdered Plagueis and became the Sith Master. He was now the most senior Sith alive. For the first time in the whole story, there was no one above him. What that meant practically, everything from this point was his own plan, his own choices, his own execution. Plagueis had been a partner of sorts in the Grand Plan's final phase. The political and financial architecture was more Plagueis' domain, the direct Senate manoeuvring more Sidious's. With his master gone, Sidious absorbed all of it. He was the political strategist, the Sith Master, the Chancellor-to-be, and the person building the hidden war machine, all of it simultaneously. He was also now required to have an actual Sith apprentice of his own to satisfy the Rule of Two. Maul had been functioning in that grey area for years. Now the structure clarified. Maul was the apprentice until he wasn't. Whether Sidious felt anything about Plagueis' death is genuinely unclear. The man had spent 17 years in close collaboration with his master, learning essentially everything he knew, and he killed him without apparent hesitation when the moment came. Whether that's because he felt nothing, or because feeling something didn't stop him, is one of the more genuinely unresolvable questions in the whole character. What the story gives you is not grief and not guilt, just the next thing. Something about the opera scene in Revenge of the Sith that I think rewards attention. Palpatine tells Anakin the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise. He frames it as information he's heard, as lore he came across. I thought not. It's not a story the Jedi would tell you. He positions himself as a curious historian sharing an interesting piece of Sith history. He's describing his own master, talking about a person he spent 17 years with, learned everything from, and then murdered in his sleep, to a young man he's cultivating for exactly the purpose his master had told him to pursue. The detachment in that framing, the ability to tell that story in that room, to that person, in that tone, as if it's simply an anecdote, is either the clearest demonstration of who Palpatine is or the most complete performance. Perhaps both. The specific element of the story he emphasizes for Anakin is the possibility of preventing death, of keeping the ones you love from dying. He knows about Padme. He knows about the visions. He has been watching Anakin closely enough to understand exactly which part of this story will land like a hook. And he tells it with perfect casual timing at the opera, surrounded by light and spectacle, as if it's just an interesting thing that came up. There's also a secondary irony that the story mentions Plagueis as someone who could even keep the ones he cared about from dying. Whether Plagueis cared about Sidious in any meaningful sense is itself ambiguous. Whether Sidious cared about Plagueis is more ambiguous still, but the story implies a kind of devotional power, the ability to protect people you love, and presents it to someone who is defined by his fear of losing people he loves. The manipulation is extraordinarily precise, and it's made possible specifically by Sidious having killed the person he learned it from. The Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo in 32 BBY is the point where the plan stopped being theoretical and started being a sequence of events you could watch happening. Everything that followed grew from this. The Trade Federation was, in this period, one of the most powerful non-governmental entities in the galaxy. They had a massive commercial fleet, a large droid army, and Senate representation through client worlds they'd essentially purchased. They also had real financial exposure. Recent taxation of trade routes was genuinely eating into their margins, and they were furious about it in a comprehensible, if not particularly sympathetic, way. Sidious had been cultivating their leadership for years. Viceroy Newt Gunray specifically had been made to feel like Darth Sidious was his ally in the Senate, someone who was quietly working to protect Federation interests, even as Palpatine publicly said moderate things about everything. What Gunray didn't understand was that he was being positioned as a tool, not protected. The plan for Naboo was designed to achieve two things simultaneously. First, Finis Valorum, the current Supreme Chancellor, needed to be removed from office. Valorum was a genuine Republican, and his presence at the top of the system made certain things harder. He was also, by this point, politically weakened by a series of controversies that had eroded his authority, controversies that Sidious had, in some cases, quietly exacerbated. He was ready to fall. Someone just needed to push. Second, Palpatine needed a mechanism to push him. He needed a crisis dramatic enough that the Senate would be moved to act, but channeled in a specific direction. The blockade of his own homeworld was, from a certain angle, quite elegant as a solution. It gave Palpatine a personal reason to be upset, a visible injustice to point to, and a vehicle to bring Queen Amidala, young, genuine, and furious, to the Senate floor, at exactly the moment he needed her there. The mechanics of that guidance are quietly remarkable. Palpatine told Amidala that the Senate's bureaucracy and accusations of corruption made it unable to help her, and advised her to call for a vote of no confidence. The system won't move unless you force it. Call for a vote of no confidence in Valorum. He phrased it as frank advice from a loyal ally. He was simultaneously removing his closest political friend from office and engineering his own election, using a teenage queen as the instrument. She didn't understand what she was being pointed at. She called the vote. Valorum was removed. Meanwhile, Darth Maul was deployed to find the Jedi, who had escaped from Naboo with Amidala, Qui-Gon Jinn, and his Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi. On Tatooine, Maul made contact, but didn't complete the assignment. On Naboo itself, in the Theed power generator, the actual confrontation happened. Maul killed Qui-Gon Jinn and was then bisected by Obi-Wan Kenobi, falling into a reactor shaft, presumed dead. Sidious was informed and reacted with what appears to be genuine irritation rather than grief. Maul had been a weapon, and the weapon had malfunctioned. A replacement would need to be found. In the Senate, the vote of no confidence produced the expected result. Palpatine was elected the new Supreme Chancellor by an enormous margin. He was the candidate everyone trusted. The moderate, the honest broker, the man from the planet being invaded who had never seemed to want anything for himself. The galaxy handed him the most powerful office in the Republic, and he received it with what appeared to be appropriate humility. "I will not forget this," he told the cheering Senate chamber, which turned out to be entirely true. Valorum, watching his career end in real time, was apparently completely blindsided. He'd thought Palpatine was his friend. The Jedi, for their part, were occupied with the Naboo crisis itself, and then with the discovery that Qui-Gon had died at the hands of what appeared to be a Sith. They told the new Chancellor that the Sith seemed to have returned. He received this information with appropriate concern and a very particular kind of composure. This is, in some ways, the most audacious single piece of the whole setup. Not because of its scale, though the scale is considerable, but because of how perfectly it weaponized good intentions. Jedi Master Sifo Dyas was a member of the Order in the decade before the Clone Wars, and he had what the Council considered an unfortunate tendency toward prophecy. He kept having visions of large-scale conflict coming, kept telling his colleagues that the Republic would need a real army at some point, kept being told that the Order wasn't in the business of building armies, and that his visions were his own anxieties speaking. He was a genuine believer, genuinely convinced of what he was seeing. At some point around 32 BBY, acting without the Council's knowledge or approval, Sifo Dyas commissioned a clone army from the cloners of Kuhmino, a world of sophisticated genetic engineers who lived on an ocean-covered planet and had been making their living from large-scale cloning contracts for generations. He commissioned it, while the Sith Lord Darth Tyrannus paid for it, arranged the genetic template, a Mandalorian bounty hunter named Jango Fett, and initiated production of what he believed would be the Republic's future defense. Then Darth Sidious had him killed. Count Dooku, who was at this point being cultivated as a potential Sith apprentice, was used to handle this and to take over the project. The Kaminoans, who simply needed the contract to continue and didn't particularly care who was actually running it, were given Tyrannus as the new contact. Dooku then had the records of Kumino erased from the Jedi archives, so when the army eventually came to light, the Order would have no prior record of it, no context for it, and no particular reason to be suspicious. The inhibitor chips were the addition that turned the whole thing from a clone army into a time bomb. Every clone embryo received one at stage 3 of development. The Kaminoans were told they were behavioural regulators, safeguards to prevent the clones from inheriting Jango Fett's more aggressive tendencies, and secondary safeguards against renegade Jedi. That second purpose was the relevant one. The chips were switches hardwired into every clone in the army, waiting for critical commands, like Order 66. Clone Trooper 5s came extraordinarily close to unraveling the entire thing. About a year before the end of the Clone Wars, a fellow trooper named Tup had his chip malfunction. It activated early, causing him to kill a Jedi general in the middle of a battle. The incident triggered an investigation. Fives and Shock T eventually traced the malfunction to the chips, removed Fives' own chip, and discovered that every clone in the army had one. Fives brought his evidence directly to Chancellor Palpatine. Palpatine met with Fives alone, accused him of attacking him, had him branded a lunatic, and arranged for the evidence to be discredited. Fives escaped, eventually reached Anakin Skywalker and Captain Rex, and told them everything. He couldn't quite prove it. He was killed by Coruscant guard clones before anything could be done. He died trying to tell Anakin Skywalker that the Chancellor was running a conspiracy against the Jedi, and he didn't have quite enough to make it stick. Anakin was in that room when Fives tried to warn him. He didn't believe it. Fives is one of the more genuinely tragic figures in the whole saga, I think. A clone trooper who figured out the single most important secret in the galaxy, reached the person who might have been able to act on it, and ran out of time. There's a specific quality to that kind of near miss that's hard to shake. The army that the Jedi marched beside for 3 years, that they fought with, and in some cases formed genuine bonds with, was a weapon pointed at them the entire time. Most of the clones didn't know. When Order 66 activated and they turned on their Jedi commanders, they were people whose bodies had been hijacked. Some managed to resist. Rex succeeded in removing his chip in time. Most of them didn't. There's a dimension to the clone army that I think gets underplayed, which is what the relationship between the Jedi and the clones actually became over the 3 years of the war, and what that means for how Order 66 lands emotionally. The Jedi Order was philosophically not enthusiastic about becoming a military institution. They were peacekeepers, investigators, diplomats. Being handed an army and told to command it in a galactic war was not the role the Order had trained for, and there were prominent voices within the Order who were uncomfortable with it from the beginning. Mace Windu, for all his formidability as a fighter, was never fully at ease with the Clone Wars, as a shape for what the Jedi were supposed to be. Yoda himself expressed reservations, though he nonetheless led troops on Kashyyyk when the moment came. But 3 years is a long time, and the clones were genuinely remarkable beings. They had distinct personalities despite sharing a genetic template. Individual units developed their own cultures, their own nicknames, their own relationships with their Jedi commanders. The 501st under Anakin and Ahsoka, the 212th under Obi-Wan. Rex, whose relationship with Ahsoka became something genuinely meaningful over time. Cody, who was with Obi-Wan when Order 66 was issued, and who gave the order to fire on him on command, grimly and without apparent hesitation, even having fought alongside him for years. The tragedy of the inhibitor chips, a concept we covered earlier, is partly the tragedy of that relationship being weaponized. The chips didn't erase the clones' personalities or their genuine attachments. Some of them actively struggled against the command as it activated, which is documented in several accounts of that day. Rex fought it hard enough to communicate to Ahsoka that she should find Fives, the trooper who had died trying to expose the conspiracy before the chip fully took hold. The resistance was real, even when it couldn't stop the outcome. Palpatine had arranged, with the inhibitor chip system, for the Jedi to be killed by the people they had come to trust most completely. That's a particular cruelty that goes beyond mere tactical efficiency. You could have arranged to kill the Jedi in many ways, arranging for their deaths to come from inside their own armies, from soldiers they'd fought with, and in some cases cared about, produces a specific kind of devastation that a direct assault from enemies would not have. Whether Sidious specifically wanted that quality, or whether it was simply the most efficient available method, is, like many things about him, genuinely hard to determine. Dooku is the most complicated of the 3 major apprentices, and in some ways the most interesting, because he wasn't empty, he actually believed things. Before he became Darth Tyrannus, he was Jedi Master Dooku of the House of Sereno, a nobleman with old money and genuine standing in the Order, known for an elegant lightsaber form and an intellectual precision that made him one of the more respected figures in the Temple. He had been a High Council member at various points. He had trained Qui-Gon Jinn. He was, in every visible way, the anti-establishment, and then he left the Order quietly around 32 BBY and eventually became the political head of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the separatist movement that would give Sidious his war. What made Dooku susceptible wasn't stupidity or weakness. It was the uncomfortable fact that a significant portion of what he believed about the Republic was accurate. The Senate was corrupt. The Trade Federation and the banking lobbies had enormous influence over legislation. The Jedi Order had become politically entangled in a way that compromised its independence. Dooku saw all of this clearly, and was genuinely angry about it in ways that weren't entirely unreasonable. Sidious offered him a way to act on that anger, while also offering something Dooku would probably have found more difficult to admit wanting: power. As Darth Tyrannus, he was one of two most important people in the galaxy, running the separatist movement and serving as the public face of a war that Sidious needed to run for as long as possible. He told Obi-Wan in the Geonosian arena that the Senate was under the control of a Sith Lord. He wasn't lying. He was giving Kenobi true information and counting on it being disbelieved, which it was. The Jedi Council immediately dismissed it as untrue, and unable to reconcile it with their knowledge of Palpatine, they filed it away as Dooku being manipulative and moved on. His relationship with Sidious contained a mutual suspicion that both parties were probably aware of. Dooku was intelligent enough to know he might eventually be replaced. Sidious knew Dooku's loyalty was to his own vision of order rather than to the Sith cause per se. The arrangement worked as long as it was useful, which it was for roughly a decade. His death deserves a moment. On the bridge of General Grievous's flagship, captured, hands cut off, at the mercy of Anakin Skywalker, and Sidious told Anakin to finish it. Do it. Dooku's face in that moment, in the film, is one of the better pieces of acting in the whole saga. The realization, completely and suddenly, of what's happening. He's been delivered to his own replacement. He was always intended to be used and then discarded. He just didn't think it would happen quite like this. Anakin does it. And Sidious from across the room tells Anakin he did well, framing an execution as an achievement. A note on something Dooku did that complicated Sidious's plans somewhat. During the Clone Wars, he trained 3 of his own successive apprentices: Asajj Ventress, Savage Opress, and at various points Quinlan Vos, without Sidious's approval. That's a violation of the rule of 2. Sidious found out about Ventress and ordered Dooku to eliminate her. Dooku attempted it. She survived. The whole subplot of Dooku operating partially outside the framework, while thinking he was within it, illustrates quite nicely how the rule of 2 actually functioned in practice. Sidious was always the actual master, and any deviation from that hierarchy was eventually corrected, whether or not the deviants survived to reflect on the lesson. The Clone Wars lasted just under 3 years, from the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY to the fall of Coruscant and the execution of Order 66 in 19 BBY. During those 3 years, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine directed the Republic war effort. Darth Sidious directed the separatist effort through Dooku, Grievous, and various agents. And the war ran exactly as long as Sidious needed it to. The part I find genuinely striking is the logistics of it. He was the Chancellor. He was chairing meetings about military strategy, appearing sympathetic when worlds were destroyed, concerned when the Jedi reported setbacks, decisive when the Senate needed leadership. He was also, through encrypted channels, telling Dooku where to hit, when to retreat, which battles to lose in order to create the right political pressure on the Republic's side. He was on both sides of every significant strategic decision for 3 years, simultaneously. The emergency powers accumulation was the most visible part of the plan in progress, for anyone who had the right framework to see it. The Senate had voted him emergency powers at the start of the war, presented as a temporary measure for an extraordinary situation. As the war continued, those powers were renewed, expanded, and incrementally made more permanent through legislation that was either engineered directly or created conditions where senators felt they had no reasonable choice. By the end, Palpatine had authority that the founders of the Republic would have found alarming, and the Senate had largely consented to granting it, piece by piece, across 3 years. What the Jedi were doing during this period? They were generals. They were commanding armies across hundreds of fronts simultaneously, stretched extraordinarily thin. The Clone Wars systematically removed them from Coruscant, from proximity to the Senate and the Chancellor, from their best position to observe what was actually happening at the institutional level. By the time Anakin Skywalker was placed on the Jedi Council at Palpatine's request, a constitutional oddity that the Council found troubling but couldn't easily refuse without offending the Chancellor. During a war, the Order was operating under conditions that made clear-headed assessment of the political situation quite difficult. General Grievous is a brief detour worth making. He was a Kalish warrior who had, through events partly engineered by Dooku, ended up rebuilt as a cyborg, the organic components encased in a mechanical body, with a respiratory condition that came from his original organic components never fully healing. He was genuinely dangerous, genuinely fanatic about fighting Jedi, which made him a useful field commander. But in the broader picture, he was primarily a distraction, a visible, threatening face for the separatist military that the Jedi could be pointed at and kept occupied with. The kidnapping of Palpatine during the Battle of Coruscant, the opening sequence of Revenge of the Sith, was orchestrated. Sidious wanted to be rescued by Anakin Skywalker specifically, for reasons to do with what came next. The moment where Anakin is given the opportunity to execute Dooku with Sidious watching happens precisely because Sidious set it up to happen that way. It was a test. Anakin passed it in the way Sidious needed him to. A note on what the Clone Wars actually cost, and I think it's worth being direct about this, because it's easy for it to blur into abstraction. Billions of deaths across the galaxy. Many worlds were devastated or destabilized, with generations of economic damage concentrated in the Outer Rim. The suffering was real, distributed, and almost entirely unnecessary in the sense that the entire war existed to serve a single person's agenda. Sidious, as far as the source material can determine, never expressed the faintest concern about any of that. The closest you get to interiority around the scale of the damage is the suggestion, in various Legends material, that he found watching the Republic tear itself apart genuinely, aesthetically satisfying. The Sith tradition did not tend to value life for its own sake, and Sidious was a devoted practitioner. There's a bit more to say about how Sidious actually ran both sides of the war, because it's more interesting than the summary suggests. On the Republic side, his role was relatively transparent from a governance standpoint. He was the Chancellor. He received military briefings from the Jedi High Command, from clone generals, from planetary governors. He approved strategy, allocated resources, made the public speeches about sacrifice and vigilance that wartime leadership requires. He was very good at this. The Republic's military record during the Clone Wars was actually reasonable. They won more campaigns than they lost. They held crucial territories. They pushed back separatist incursions when it mattered. This was important because a republic that was obviously losing the war would have created political conditions Sidious didn't want. The war needed to run long enough to justify his emergency powers and to achieve the psychological conditions he was cultivating. But the Republic also needed to feel like it was capable of winning, or the Senate wouldn't have kept granting him the authority he needed. On the separatist side, his communications were carefully isolated. The channel to Dooku was encrypted and irregular, arranged through intermediaries and dead drops, and secure facilities the Jedi had no reason to monitor. His instructions to Dooku were mostly strategic rather than tactical. He was directing the shape of the war, not micromanaging individual battles. Lose this campaign slowly, or hold this system until the political pressure on Coruscant reaches the required point, rather than deploy battle droids to this specific grid coordinate. Dooku handled the operational side. Grievous handled the actual fighting. What Sidious needed the Clone Wars to produce, strategically, was three things. First, exhaustion. Both the Republic and its Jedi needed to be stretched across too many fronts to think clearly about the political changes happening at home. Second, emergency powers normalization. The Senate needed to have granted expanded authority, not once, but many times, each time making the next expansion seem like a smaller step. Third Anakin, the cultivation of the Chosen One, needed the right conditions to reach the right point, and the Clone Wars provided both the opportunity for Palpatine to spend time with Anakin and the specific pressures that would make Anakin vulnerable to the argument Sidious was building toward. All three were achieved. The timing of the war's end was, in this sense, Sidious's choice as much as it was anyone else's. The relationship between Palpatine and Anakin Skywalker is, taken in full, one of the more carefully constructed things in the whole story. It started when Anakin was 9 years old. It ran for 36 years, and the reason it worked as well as it did is that Palpatine understood very precisely what Anakin needed and made himself into that thing. When a 9-year-old arrived on Coruscant from Tatooine, freed from slavery, separated from his mother, placed in a temple full of people telling him he'd started his training too late, and that his attachment to his mother was a liability, Senator Palpatine expressed a personal interest in him. He remembered the boy's name. He asked after him. He made him feel individually noticed in an environment where Anakin often felt like a problem to be managed. Palpatine's attention to Anakin continued for around 13 years. Through Anakin's training, through his Padawan years, through his knighthood and the Clone Wars. Palpatine was always there as the warm presence who didn't judge, who understood, who could see things the Jedi Council apparently couldn't. He had access to Anakin in ways the Council didn't monitor carefully enough, and he used it to build a specific kind of intimacy, the kind where Anakin felt that Palpatine understood him better than anyone else in the galaxy. What made Anakin specifically useful for Sidious's purposes? He was genuinely the most powerful Force user alive, probably by a significant margin. He was deeply emotionally reactive in ways the Jedi training tried to suppress but couldn't. He was attached to Obi-Wan, to Padme, to his mother, in ways the Jedi Code told him were dangerous, and he'd already proved what that attachment could produce. The killing of the Sand People on Tatooine after Shmi's death was something Sidious almost certainly knew about, and mentally filed away as a useful data point about what Anakin was capable of when fear became rage. The attachment to Padme was, in retrospect, the key variable. Anakin had loved her since he was 9, and she'd never entirely left his thoughts since. By the time of the Clone Wars, they were secretly married. He was terrified of losing her. That fear had a specific texture, not just I might lose someone I love, which is universal, but something closer to a conviction that the universe owed him this and would take it away. A kind of anticipatory grief that could be aimed like a weapon if you knew where to point it. The moment came in the form of visions. Anakin began having premonitions of Padme dying in childbirth. He didn't fully understand them, couldn't control them, couldn't dismiss them. He told Palpatine. Palpatine told him, at the opera one evening, a story about a Sith Lord who could manipulate midi-chlorians to prevent death, who could keep the ones he cared about from dying. He presented it as historical lore, as something that might or might not be possible, as an intellectual curiosity. He watched Anakin's face as he said it. He had been building toward that specific conversation for 13 years. That's either extraordinary patience or something that doesn't quite have an ordinary name. By the time the Jedi Council asked Anakin to spy on the Chancellor, placing him in the position of betraying either his teachers or his closest friend, the emotional architecture was already in place. When Mace Windu moved to arrest Palpatine, the choice Anakin faced wasn't really a philosophical one. It was between an institution that had always made him feel slightly too much and slightly too late, and a man who had always made him feel, specifically, individually understood. Sidious told him the dark side offered knowledge of how to save Padme. Anakin chose it. There's a version of reading this that's sympathetic to Anakin, and a version that's somewhat unsympathetic, and honestly, neither fully resolves the discomfort. What you're looking at is a man who spent decades engineering the psychological conditions for a specific person's collapse, using warmth and patience, and the long performance of genuine affection as his tools. It's not a comfortable thing to look at directly. The manipulation is extraordinary. The result is tragedy. Both of those things are true at once. One detail I find quietly devastating. Palpatine told Vader in the aftermath of Mustafar that Padme had died, that Anakin himself had killed her. Whether Palpatine knew she was still alive in that moment is left ambiguous. What's clear is that Vader was told she was dead before he could find out otherwise. She died shortly afterward of what the medical droids classified, somewhat poetically, as loss of will to live. The knowledge Anakin had turned for wasn't used. The person he'd turned for was gone. Palpatine had a fully committed apprentice and no remaining complication. The sequence of events in 19 BBY, in the final days of the Clone Wars, moves fast once it starts. It had been building for decades. The execution took roughly 48 hours. The Jedi Council had grown increasingly wary of Palpatine's motives over the preceding months. His insistence on remaining Chancellor beyond his legal term, the ongoing accumulation of emergency powers, his strange personal closeness with Anakin Skywalker. When Anakin told them, forced into it by Palpatine himself, who had revealed his identity to Anakin and apparently calculated that this would accelerate the confrontation, the council moved quickly. Mace Windu led a team of 4 masters to the Chancellor's office to arrest him. The arrest went badly, which was probably the plan. Palpatine revealed his Sith nature fully, killed 3 of the 4 masters, in moments with a speed that is difficult to watch even knowing what he is, and was in the process of being disarmed by Windu when Anakin arrived. The choice Anakin made in that room, intervening to stop Windu from executing the Chancellor, gave Palpatine the moment he'd been waiting for. The lightning that followed, the disfigurement, the fall of Windu, it was a scene Sidious had probably been mentally rehearsing for a long time. With Anakin formally turned and renamed Darth Vader, Sidious issued Order 66. Across the galaxy, clone commanders received the command. The inhibitor chips, explained in our earlier section, activated. The effect was essentially instantaneous. Soldiers who had fought alongside Jedi generals for 3 years turned and shot them. Master Ki-Adi-Mundi on my ghetto, surrounded by battle droids one moment, shot from behind by his own men the next. Aayla Secura on Felucia, walking through tall grass, cut down. Plo Koon's fighter destroyed by his own escort above Cato Neimoidia. Hundreds of Jedi across the galaxy, taken completely by surprise. The assault on the Jedi Temple on Coruscant was led by Vader and the 501st Legion. The details of what happened inside are mostly implied rather than shown, and the source material handles it with appropriate restraint. It included, among other things, the younglings. The Jedi who survived the night were the ones who were simply far enough away from their clones, or fortunate enough, or powerful enough to see it coming in time. A very small number. Yoda survived because 2 Wookiees on Kashyyyk, Tarful and Chewbacca cut a path through clone troopers in the chaos and launched him off-planet in a hidden escape pod. That's its own remarkable story, and one covered separately if you're interested. The short version is that they had planned for something like this, which says something about Wookiee foresight that the galaxy probably underestimated for too long. The speech Palpatine gave to the Senate the following morning is worth a moment. He appeared disfigured, injured, the picture of a man who had barely survived an attempt on his life. He told the Senate the Jedi Order had committed treason, had attempted to assassinate him, had sought to overthrow the Republic. He framed the Order's defensive response as confirmation of the plot. He declared a new order. Senator Amidala's line in that scene, "So this is how liberty dies with thunderous applause," is exactly the right line for that moment. The Senate voted for the Empire. Most of them were not villains. They were frightened people who'd been handed a compelling story and told that the alternative was chaos. That's how these things tend to work across most kinds of history. The Jedi who survived scattered. The Order, as an institution, was over. Obi-Wan went to Tatooine. Yoda went to Dagobah. The inquisitorious dark side practitioners working for the new Empire, some of them fallen Jedi, were set to hunting the survivors. And Sheev Palpatine stood in front of a cheering Senate chamber and became Emperor of the galaxy he had spent decades preparing to own. The declaration of the Empire in 19 BBY is not the end of the story, it's more like a transition between chapters. Sidious had spent decades working toward this moment, and the Empire was the thing that emerged. But what it actually was, how it was structured and what it was designed to do, is worth taking a bit of time on. The immediate changes were structural. The Senate was retained initially, but progressively hollowed out. It became a body that debated and voted and issued statements, while actual power was held by the Emperor and his appointed governors. When the Senate was eventually dissolved, not long before the events of the original trilogy, it was largely a formal acknowledgement of something that had been functionally true for years already. The regional governor system replaced the Republic's more federated structure. Moffs oversaw sectors, Grand Moffs oversaw larger strategic zones. The Imperial Security Bureau maintained surveillance. The Commission for the Preservation of the New Order handled ideological conformity. It was a multi-layered control architecture with a specific quality of systems designed by someone who doesn't trust anyone. Lots of redundancy, lots of overlapping jurisdictions, lots of separate reporting lines that all fed back to the top. The Stormtrooper program replaced the clone army over time. The clones were phased out, in canon, through a manufactured scandal involving the destruction of Kumino that Palpatine had secretly arranged and then pinned on a convenient vice admiral. The transition to conscripted human soldiers was presented as a necessity. The practical reason was simpler. The clones' accelerated aging gave them a limited useful lifespan, and human conscripts were cheaper and easier to produce in quantity. The Death Star's construction had begun even before the Empire was formally declared. The plans, originally Geonosian in design, delivered to Dooku and then to Sidious during the Clone Wars, had been in development since the war's early years. Construction accelerated under Grand Moff Tarkin's supervision, above Geonosis and then elsewhere. Tarkin understood it as Palpatine's preferred governing philosophy made literal. Rule through the fear of Force rather than Force itself. The planet-killing capability mattered less as a weapon than as a demonstration of what the alternative to compliance looked like. Vader's role in the Imperial period was as the visible enforcement instrument, the thing the galaxy was afraid of, the presence that could appear anywhere and address problems that ordinary Imperial machinery couldn't handle. The relationship between Palpatine and Vader in this period is genuinely unusual. Vader was kept useful, kept loyal through a combination of dark side binding and practical dependency on the Emperor's knowledge of things that Vader still somewhere beneath everything needed, but not trusted with anything that might make him independent. He knew almost nothing about the Death Star until quite late. He knew nothing about Sidious's longer-term projects. He was powerful and, in a specific sense, contained. What Palpatine actually seemed to want from the Empire, beyond having it, is a question the source material circles without fully landing on. He had the galaxy. He spent the Imperial period holding it, expanding military capacity, suppressing resistance, pursuing Force-related research through various means. The Legends material suggests a personal philosophy in which the dark side was literally the universe's dominant reality, and the Jedi's vision of the Force was a kind of collective delusion. Whether he believed that, or whether it was a rationalization for something more simply acquisitive, is, again, genuinely hard to determine. For the core worlds, particularly for humans in the core worlds, the early Empire was not dramatically uncomfortable. That was deliberate. You don't maintain control through universal suffering. You maintain it by giving enough people enough of what they want that resistance seems like a sacrifice not worth making. The suffering was distributed outward, into the outer rim, into alien populations, into anyone who didn't fit the profile of the New Order's preferred citizen. Wookiees into forced labor. Mon Calamari shipyards nationalized. Species after species subjected to systems designed to take what was useful and manage the rest. The rebel alliance that eventually formed was made up of exactly the people that distribution had failed. Outer rim systems, with nothing left to lose, worlds that had been on the wrong side of imperial policy, individuals who had been close enough to see what the machinery actually looked like from the inside. The Empire's governing philosophy is actually more structured than be mean to people, which sounds obvious but is worth making explicit, because the structure tells you something about how Palpatine thought about the problem of controlling a galaxy of trillions. The Death Star is the most visible symbol of the Imperial governing approach, and Tarkin's articulation of it, that fear of force is more useful than force itself, is more or less the official doctrine. You don't actually need to destroy every rebellious planet. You need to destroy one, visibly, and then maintain the credible threat of doing it again. The planets that comply out of fear cost you nothing. The ones that don't comply provide the demonstration that keeps the others in line. It's a brutal calculation, but it's a calculation, not simple sadism. The intelligence architecture ran on similar principles. The Imperial Security Bureau, the Compnor network, the various overlapping surveillance and enforcement bodies. These weren't just about catching actual dissidents. They were about ensuring that everyone knew they might be watched, which produces much of the compliance that actually watching everyone would produce, at a fraction of the administrative cost. Palpatine understood this. Surveillance doesn't need to be total to be effective. It needs to be total enough that people behave as if it were. The alien species policies are interesting from this angle because they served a dual function. The overt speciesism of the Empire was partly ideological. Palpatine seems to have genuinely believed in human supremacy in a sense that aligned with Sith philosophy about natural hierarchies of power. But it was also practically useful, identifying populations that could be exploited with limited political cost to the core constituency. Humans in the core worlds, who might otherwise resist authoritarian governance, could be given a target for their anxieties that wasn't the Emperor. It's the oldest governing trick there is, and it worked reasonably well for 20 years. What eventually undermined it was simpler than any of the ideological challenges the Rebel Alliance was mounting. The Empire's economic model was essentially extractive. Take resources from the periphery, concentrate them in the core, use military power to suppress the resentment this created. Extractive models work until they strip the periphery below the level where it has anything left to lose. At that point, the people who were previously compliant because they had something to lose become people with nothing to lose, and the threat of force stops being a deterrent. The Rebel Alliance was made of people from all walks of life. Grand Moff Tarkin understood this, and the Death Star was partly his solution to the problem. If you can make the cost of rebellion not just defeat but total planetary annihilation, you push the nothing left to lose calculation significantly further out. It was a reasonable theory. It didn't account for the fact that demonstrating the Death Star on Alderaan would produce some of the most spectacular rebel recruitment material in galactic history. The Emperor came to the second Death Star above Endor in 4 ABY because he knew the Rebel Alliance was coming, and he wanted to be there for it. This sometimes gets presented as Palpatine walking into a trap. He wasn't. He set the trap. The location of the second Death Star, the timing of its apparent near completion, the calculated leak of information to the Alliance through a deliberately placed agent, all of it was designed to bring the Rebel fleet to Endor at a moment when the Death Star was operational enough to be a weapon but appeared to be still under construction, and when Vader could deliver Luke Skywalker to him personally. The throne room sequence is interesting for what it reveals about how Palpatine operated at his most comfortable. He had Luke brought to him, watched the Rebel fleet being destroyed below, offered Luke a choice between watching his friends die and accepting the inevitable, and seemed genuinely, quietly entertained by the situation. He was not performing menace. He was not trying to be frightening. He was relaxed. He had constructed this outcome down to considerable detail. What he had not constructed or had underestimated was Vader watching Luke being tortured. The source material is fairly clear that Palpatine had monitored and analysed Vader for 23 years and had concluded that the Anakin Skywalker component was functionally gone, suppressed, buried, dealt with by the cumulative weight of everything since Mustafar. Vader had been the Emperor's instrument in the intervening years in ways that supported that reading. The man had done terrible things without apparent hesitation. He had not, across 2 decades, done anything that strongly suggested the person underneath was still present in any meaningful way. But watching your son being killed appears to be a different variable from the one Sidious had been measuring. Vader threw him into the reactor shaft. The irony is clean. The variable that undid him was the one he'd used most precisely to build his greatest apprentice: attachment. The willingness to sacrifice for someone specific. He'd weaponized it in Anakin to create Vader, and Vader used it against him 23 years later. Palpatine's body was destroyed. The galaxy rejoiced, largely without understanding the mechanism of what had just happened. The Rebel Alliance celebrated. The Empire began to fragment, slowly at first and then faster. The Sith line of Darth Bane, which had been running for 1,000 years with 2 practitioners at a time, appeared to have finally ended, though, as the next 30 years would demonstrate, Sidious had planned for that too. One of the quieter details about Palpatine's character is that he appears to have genuinely disliked the idea of anything surviving him that he hadn't personally designed and authorized. The contingency is the clearest illustration of that instinct taken to its logical conclusion. Before Endor, Sidious had prepared orders to be executed in the event of his death. Operation Cinder was the most immediately visible element: specific worlds, selected according to criteria that aren't fully explained in the source material, targeted for devastating orbital bombardment by automated Imperial weapons platforms. Naboo was on the list, his homeworld. Whether there's something meaningful in that specific inclusion, or whether it was simply the thoroughness of a man who left no exceptions, the sources decline to say clearly. The broader contingency had a different shape from pure destruction. Rather than simply ensuring nothing survived, it was designed to funnel Imperial assets, officers, ships, technology, resources into the unknown regions, away from the New Republic's reach, to seed a second attempt at something Palpatine had already achieved once. Gallius Rax, a figure from the Aftermath trilogy, was the instrument for this. Palpatine had encountered him as a child on Jakku, a desert world in the Mid-Rim that was, apparently, significant to Sidious for reasons connected to something buried deep in the planet's geology. Rax had been positioned specifically for this eventual moment without knowing it for most of his life. The logic of deliberately destroying the existing empire rather than trying to preserve it through succession is genuinely strange from the outside. You'd expect someone who'd spent decades building an institution to protect it. The contingency's implicit argument seems to be that the empire as it existed had become too compromised by the incompetence and ambition of the people running it to be worth preserving, that burning it down and starting again from a purified core was the correct strategic choice. Darth Bane had operated on similar reasoning 1,000 years earlier. Destroy what exists to make room for what should exist. There's a consistency to it, even if the consistency is somewhat alarming. I'll be honest, the Jakku lore is one of those areas where the canon gets genuinely murky, and I'm not sure anyone has fully untangled it. There's a Sith wayfinder, a dark side vergence buried somewhere in the planet's geology, some connection to Palpatine's personal relationship with the Force that apparently predates the Empire by decades. The newer canon has expanded on it without entirely clarifying it. What's clear is that Jakku mattered to Palpatine for reasons that weren't purely logistical, and that the contingency centered on it was deliberate, not arbitrary. The fleet that was being built in the unknown regions, what would eventually become the final order at Exegol, had been under construction for years before Endor. The Sith eternal cult that maintained the Exegol facilities had been running in the background of Palpatine's plans since at least the Imperial period, probably considerably longer. The contingency was, in this sense, not a response to defeat. It was always part of the plan. Endor was not an ending. It was a transition. There's something deeply Sith about all of this, in the specific way that Sith thinking tends to operate. Bane designed a system and trusted it to future generations. Palpatine designed a system and trusted no one. The difference is instructive about what 65 years of Sith mastery actually produced in him. Not confidence in the tradition, but the conviction that he was the only one capable of carrying it correctly. Exegol is introduced in The Rise of Skywalker as a hidden Sith world in the unknown regions, difficult to reach without a Sith wayfinder, a dark side nexus that amplifies Force rituals beyond what would normally be possible. It's a good location for what Palpatine needed it for, a place to wait and a place to build. The mechanics of how he survived Endor run through the idea of essence transfer, the ability to move consciousness from one body to another, which Palpatine had been developing through his study of Plagueis' research and through his own decades-long work into life extension and dark side alchemy. When his body was destroyed at Endor, he directed his consciousness toward Exegol, where the Sith eternal cultists had been preparing a vessel. The body on Exegol, when we see it in The Rise of Skywalker, is visibly deteriorating. It can't hold him fully. The throne-mounted machinery isn't aesthetic, it's functional, keeping him upright in a body that's essentially, slowly failing. His Force lightning, when he eventually channels it at full strength, is more than the vessel can sustain, which is why it ultimately destroys him, along with everything else. Each essence transfer appears to degrade the host body's ability to contain him. Snoke is a strand cast, a genetic creation rather than a standard clone, engineered with specific characteristics that Palpatine needed. He was built to serve as a proxy, a powerful seeming dark side figure that Palpatine could operate remotely, presenting himself to the First Order's leadership as the source of authority while remaining hidden on Exegol. Snoke had genuine presence and genuine Force ability. He was, functionally, a puppet. When Kylo Ren killed him, Palpatine wasn't particularly concerned, because Snoke had served his purpose, and the manipulation of Kylo Ren could continue through other channels. Project Necromancer, referenced in newer canon material from the Mandalorian-era content, connects the cloning programs running during the Imperial period to Palpatine's physical state on Exegol. The Empire had been quietly running genetic research, apparently in part toward creating vessels that could survive essence transfer more effectively than the strand casts were managing. The Exegol body is the product of that research reaching its practical limit. What Palpatine was waiting for, specifically, was something that would allow him to either restore himself physically or find a vessel capable of actually containing him at full strength. A Force dyad, a paired bond between two Force users, so strong it functions as a single entity, was the specific thing he'd been watching for. Rey and Ben Solo constituted that dyad, and when both of them were present on Exegol, the energy of their bond was something he could drain and use to restore himself. It worked, briefly and spectacularly. The 30-year wait on Exegol is strange to sit with. A man who had moved through the highest levels of galactic society for 50 years, shaping events constantly, surrounded by people he was perpetually managing, sat in a deteriorating body on a hidden planet for 3 decades. Whether that period was tedious or meditative or simply endured because the alternative was nothing, the source material doesn't say. The cultists were there. The fleet was being built. The proxies were being operated. But the person himself was essentially stationary, waiting for the right conditions, for the third and final time in his life, to step into the light. The fact that Palpatine had a son was, for most of his life, apparently not something he considered particularly significant. Dathan was a strandcast, a non-force-sensitive genetic creation from Palpatine's own material, which the Emperor described, in the terms available in the source material, as a failure, an experiment that hadn't produced what he needed. Dathan was human enough to escape Exegol at some point, ended up on Jakku, met a woman named Miramir, and together they had a daughter who was very much force-sensitive. Rey, the midi-chlorian count that hadn't manifested in Dathan, manifested quite fully in his daughter. She was, from Palpatine's perspective, exactly what the Strandcast program had been trying to produce. A descendant with the force sensitivity and the raw power to serve as a proper vessel. His plan, the one still running when she arrived on Exegol, was to get her to kill him in anger, which would allow his spirit to transfer into her body, rather than remain in the deteriorating clone. His bloodline would then contain him, permanently, in a form that could actually hold his full power. Her parents hid her on Jakku to keep her from him, and then he arranged for his agents to find them and have them killed when she was still a small child. The reasoning being that grief, isolation, and a particular kind of unresolved anger were useful states to produce in someone you intended to manipulate toward a specific violent act. It's a plan that requires a certain detachment from the fact that you're organizing the murder of your own son and daughter-in-law. Palpatine managed it without visible difficulty. What he didn't fully account for, or chose to underestimate, was the Force dyad. Rey and Ben Solo, Kylo Ren, had a bond running through the Force, in ways that neither fully understood, and that Palpatine thought he could exploit entirely on his own terms. He did exploit it initially. Draining the combined energy of their dyad restored him physically in a way the clone body hadn't been able to sustain on its own. He was, for a moment after that drain, essentially what he'd been at his peak. But Rey had both Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber and Leia Organa's lightsaber, and the voices of the Jedi who had come before her, which is either a metaphor for what tradition and training actually give you, or quite literal, depending on how you read that particular scene. And she redirected his lightning. The specific mechanism of his final death is worth a moment. His lightning, sustained at the level he was channeling after the dyad drain, was more than even a restored body could hold. It destroyed him along with the vessel he was in. Whether there was enough left to attempt another transfer to another prepared vessel somewhere in the cultist infrastructure on Exegol, the story makes clear this was his permanent end. The implication of the scene is that this was final. Whether some future story returns to him and tests that implication is a question for whatever comes next. Ben Solo died restoring Rey's life in the aftermath of the confrontation. The dyad, as a unit, was gone. The Sith eternal cultists, without their master, appear to have simply ceased to be relevant. The fleet was destroyed. Exegol, suddenly accessible, was no longer a stronghold. The last detail worth noting, Palpatine's final plan, built across 30 years of waiting on Exegol, was undone by the same thing that had undone his first great plan at Endor. Someone chose another person over their own continuation. Vader chose Luke. Ben chose Rey. Both choices destroyed Palpatine more thoroughly than any direct assault ever had. This is the kind of question that doesn't have a clean answer, and I think that's actually appropriate for this particular story. The easy reading of Palpatine is that he was simply evil, a dark side practitioner who wanted power and obtained it through the most elaborate scheme in galactic history. That's not wrong exactly, but it misses something. He was also, genuinely, one of the most capable political operators in the history of the Republic. The speeches were actual speeches. The understanding of how institutions worked was real understanding. The persona was convincing not just because he was a good liar, but because he was genuinely competent at the thing he was pretending to be. If he'd applied those abilities without the Sith framework behind them, he could probably have been a genuinely effective Chancellor. The question of what he actually believed is harder. The Legends material gives him a coherent philosophy. The dark side was the fundamental truth of the Force. The Jedi's vision of balance, a kind of collective naivety. The Sith tradition, not evil, but honest about how power actually functioned. He thought of himself, in that material, as the Sith Ari, the prophesied perfect Sith, the living embodiment of the dark side. There was a worldview behind the plan, not just ambition. In the current canon, it's a bit less defined. He seems more straightforwardly obsessed with not dying, with permanence, with ensuring that whatever he built couldn't be taken from him. The research into immortality that started with Plagueis became his own lifelong project. The contingency, the exegol preparations, the cloning work, the essence transfer development, all of it pointed toward a man who was, underneath everything else, terrified of death in a way that even his power hadn't resolved. There's something almost poignant about that if you let yourself look at it from a certain angle. He was the most powerful dark side practitioner alive, the emperor of the galaxy, the culmination of a 1,000-year plan, and he spent decades building elaborate systems to ensure he wouldn't simply cease to exist. The problem Plagueis had been trying to solve, and that Sidious had killed Plagueis for, was still unsolved at the very end. Still the central problem. He never quite cracked it. The relationships are worth a brief thought. He killed his master. He replaced his first apprentice without apparent grief. He positioned his second apprentice for death when a replacement was available. He corrupted his third apprentice, and then told him his wife was dead before finding out if she was. He ordered the murder of his own son. The only relationship in the whole story that has any real ambiguity around it is the one with Vader, because Vader eventually chose to end him, and that choice was made out of love for someone Palpatine had been carefully watching for the preceding year or more. Whether Palpatine loved anyone, in any functional sense, is genuinely unclear. He was capable of the performance of care at an extraordinary level of sustained detail. Whether there was something underneath the performance, whether he felt the loss of Plagueis as Plagueis, or felt anything about Maul beyond the breaking of a useful instrument, the source material can't say with certainty. What I'm left with, sitting with all of this, is that Sheev Palpatine was a person born with a genuine gift for the Force, for people, for understanding systems, who encountered, at precisely the wrong moment, someone who showed him what all of that gift could be turned toward. Plagueis didn't create him. The capability was already there. But the direction it went was, in some specific and important sense, chosen. At 17, on a starship above Naboo. I don't know if that makes it more or less difficult to understand. Probably both, since we're on the topic of what Palpatine actually was in some deeper sense. I want to spend a bit more time on the Sith philosophy itself, because it's easy to treat it as simply a label for evil, and that undersells what the tradition was actually claiming about the Force. The Sith argument, in its most coherent form, goes roughly like this. The Force has a light side and a dark side, but the Jedi's insistence on the light side as the correct approach is not neutral or objective. It's a specific ideological claim that the light side represents the Force's natural state, and the dark side represents corruption. The Sith argue that this is wrong, or at least incomplete. The dark side isn't corruption, it's power, raw, unconditioned, not channeled through emotion of attachment or the artificial serenity the Jedi cultivate, but direct access to what the Force actually is when you stop trying to morally organize it. Whether that's true in the Star Wars metaphysics is genuinely ambiguous. The Force, as depicted across the saga, does seem to resist the dark side in some ways. Jedi ghost persistence being available to light side practitioners and appearing only rarely to dark side ones in a more twisted form, for instance. But the Force also allows the dark side to exist and to be enormously powerful, which the Sith take as confirmation of their thesis. Palpatine's specific position within this was the Sith Ari belief, the conviction that he was not merely a practitioner of the dark side, but its embodiment, its most perfect instrument, the thing the tradition had been building toward for 1,000 years. There's something almost religious about it, and I find that dimension of the character genuinely interesting, because it means his motivation wasn't simply, I want power. It was, I am what power at its most fundamental looks like. The galaxy ordering itself correctly around me is the natural state of things. That belief doesn't make him less dangerous. It possibly makes him more dangerous, because it immunizes him against the kinds of doubt that would eventually slow a purely self-interested actor. You can't negotiate with or offer an alternative to someone who has decided they are what the universe is pointing toward. You can only, eventually, be destroyed by them or destroy them, and hope that the one who does the destroying has better ideas about what the universe should look like. Rey and the Jedi voices that came before her had, presumably, better ideas. Whether they'll hold is, as with everything in this tradition, a question the next generation will have to answer. And that's the whole shape of it, more or less. From the Lake Country on Naboo, through 60-odd years of double life and political theatre and Sith philosophy, and at least one genuine near miss that came from a clone trooper named Fives, to a deteriorating body on a hidden world in the unknown regions. There's a lot we didn't get into properly that would each be their own long videos. The Rule of Two lineage in more depth. Darth Maul's full story after surviving Naboo, which is genuinely remarkable and somewhat unexpected. The High Republic period that young Palpatine was born into. The relationship between Vader and the Emperor across the Imperial years in more detail. The full arc of the Inquisitors. Any one of those could go as long as this.